Episode 29. When order becomes more important than freedom. Empires rarely announce their decline, and systems of control rarely introduce themselves by saying, "We are here to take your freedom." Usually, they offer something else: safety, stability, predictability, order. And science fiction keep asking one uncomfortable question: how much freedom will human beings surrender if they become afraid enough of chaos? This is the Sci-Fi Griot. I'm your host, Nicholas Cunningham. Last time we began a new journey. We moved beyond the individual question that shape our humanity and technology arch and started looking at something larger: civilization, institution, empires, power. We asked, why do empires collapse? And science fiction gave us several answers: not simply invasions, not simply military defeat, not simply economic failure. Empires often begin collapsing internally. Trust disappears, institution weakens, inequality grows, and fear spread. People lose confidence that the system exists for them, and eventually a civilization becomes vulnerable. But there's another side to that story, because when civilization become unstable, people become afraid. And frightened societies often develop a powerful desire, not necessarily for freedom, but for order. That distinction matters because freedom can feel uncertain. Freedom allows disagreement. Freedom allows unpredictability. Freedom requires responsibility. And freedom sometimes looks messy. Order promises something emotionally different. Order says someone is in control. Order says there is a plan. Order says the chaos can stop. And science fiction has always been suspicious of that promise. Not because order is inherently wrong, but functioning society requires structure, laws, institution, expectation, boundaries. The problem begins when maintaining order becomes more important than the people order was supposed to protect. So when the system begins saying freedom is dangerous, questions are dangerous, difference is dangerous, dissent is dangerous, uncertainty is dangerous, and eventually human beings themselves become variables that must be controlled. That is when order becomes something else: authoritarianism, surveillance, conformity, centralized power, and sometimes tyranny. But science fiction understands something important. Tyranny does not always arrive wearing a villain's uniform. Sometimes it arrives carrying a solution to crime, a solution to terrorism, a solution to political instability, a solution to war, a solution to social conflict, a solution to human unpredictability itself. And people may accept it because chaos feels worse. That is where we're headed today, not simply toward dictators, but toward the emotional temptation underneath authoritarian systems, the desire to make the world predictable, even if freedom becomes the price. There are a few science fiction stories illustrate this transition more clearly than Star Wars. And what makes the rise of the Galactic Empire so interesting is that Palatine does not simply conquer the Republic from outside. He uses the Republic on fear. War creates instability. Instability creates anxiety. Anxiety creates demand for decisive leadership. And every crisis gives Palatine another reason to accumulate power. Emergency authority, military authority, political authority, until eventually temporary power becomes permanent power and the republic disappears. That transformation matters because the people are not simply defeated, many of them accept it. They are tired. They want the war to end. They want security. They want stability. And Palatine understand that fear changes what people are willing to tolerate. The same society that once valued democratic institution become willing to concentrate extraordinary authority to only one person. Why? Because uncertainty has become emotionally exalting. And that brings us to one of the most memorable moments in the entire saga. Padme watches the Senate celebrate the creation of the empire. She realizes that liberty is not being destroyed against anyone's will. People are applauding, and that is the warning. Science fiction repeatedly reminds us that freedom can disappear democratically, not necessarily because everyone suddenly becomes evil, but because people become convinced that freedom itself has become dangerous, too inefficient, too divided, too chaotic, too vulnerable. And authoritarianism begins presenting itself as competent. No more debates, no more disorder, no more weakness. Someone finally has control. And that can feel comforting, especially during crisis. But Star Wars asks us to consider the cost because once power becomes concentrated, the definition of threat begins expanding. First, the threat is the enemy, then collaborators, then critics, then dissenters, then anyone unwilling to conform, and eventually obedience becomes confused with loyalty. That is one of the oldest patterns in this type of science fiction. System obsessed with order eventually becomes suspicious of difference because difference introduce unpredictability. An authoritarian system hate unpredictability. They want predictive behavior. They want predictable beliefs, predictable loyalties, predictable identities. But human beings are not predictable, and that creates the central conflict. Eventually, the system must choose this: protect human freedom or protect itself from human freedom. The empire chooses itself. And almost every authoritarian civilization in science fiction eventually makes the same choice. George Orwell's 1984 pushes this idea even further because the party does not merely want obedience, it wants control over reality itself. Language, memory, history, information, thought, even emotional loyalty. That distinction matters. A government can control behavior through force, but a truly totalitarian system wants something deeper. Deeper. It wants people to internalize the system, to police themselves, to become afraid not merely of punishment, but of thinking incorrectly. And science fiction repeatedly returns to this fear because external control has limits. You can monitor streets, you can enforce laws, you can punish behavior, but human beings still possess an interior world of memory, conscience, imagination, private belief. An authoritarian system eventually becomes uncomfortable with that private space because private thought creates the possibility of resistance. Someone can imagine another world. Someone can remember that things were different. Someone can question the official story. Someone can say, this does not have to be this way. And suddenly the system is vulnerable. That is why memory becomes so important in this type of science fiction. Control the past, and you influence what people believe is possible. If the citizen cannot remember freedom, freedom becomes difficult to imagine. If they cannot remember truth, lies become easier to normalize. If they cannot remember injustice, accountability disappears. That connects directly to themes we explored before in the Sci-Fi Griot. Memory is not simply personal. Memory can be political. Civilization can remember, Institutions remember, communities remember, and when systems begin rewriting memory, they are not merely changing history, they are narrating the future. Because people imagine tomorrow's partly through what they remember about yesterday. 1984 understands that. The party does not simply say, obey us, it attempts to determine what reality means. And once a system controls reality, then resistance becomes extraordinarily difficult because rebellion requires more than just anger. It requires the ability to imagine an alternative. That may be one of the authoritarian greatest goals, not merely eliminating opposition, but eliminating the imagination necessary to conceive of another world. Now consider Minority Report. The premise sounds almost irresistible. What if technology could stop murder before it happened? Not investigate it afterwards, but prevent it. Imagine the promise: no victim, no grieving family, no violent acts, no uncertainty, just prevention. At first, that sounds like extraordinary progress, but science fiction immediately asks what happens to freedom when prevention becomes more important than choice. The pre crime system arrests people for crime they have not yet committed. Think about what that means. The system no longer judges action, it judges predicted action, possibilities, potential future, and suddenly a person becomes guilty because an institution believes it knows what that person will become. That is an enormous psychological shift because freedom requires uncertainty. Human beings must possess the ability to choose differently, to change, to hesitate, to repent, to reconsider, to surprise us. But systems built around prediction become uncomfortable with that uncertainty. They want probabilities, risk scores, patterns, forecasts. And science fiction keep asking, what happens when probability becomes destiny? What happens when someone is treated according to what a system predicts rather than what that person has actually done? That question becomes increasingly important in technologically advanced civilization because powerful systems can collect enormous amount of information, behavior, location, purchasing, communication, relationship, preferences, pattern, and prediction become increasingly sophisticated. But Minority Report gives us an essential warning. Prediction is not the same thing as moral certainty. A safe society is desirable, but perfect safety may require perfect control, and perfect control requires eliminating uncertainty. But think about it, uncertainty is part of freedom. Freedom means human beings sometimes make bad choices. That does not mean society ignores harmful behavior. It means that we recognize something fundamental. People are moral agents, not algorithms, not probabilities, not predetermined outcomes. And perhaps that is the uncomfortable truth Minority Report forces us to confront. A society completely protected from risk may eventually need to protect itself from freedom. Think about the film V for Vendetta presents another version of controlled civilization. And once again, fear sits at the center. The society is authoritarian, media is controlled, surveillance is widespread, dissent is dangerous. But beneath all of that is a story the system repeatedly tells the population that the world is dangerous, chaos is everywhere, enemies surround you, and therefore you need us. That may be one of the most powerful forms of political control imaginable. Not simply obey because we're powerful, but obey because without us, everything will collapse. That creates dependency. The government becomes not merely authority, but emotional protection. And science fiction repeatedly warns us that fear can become infrastructure. Fear organizes behavior. Fear shapes identity. Fear determines whom people trust. Fear determines what sacrifices seem reasonable. Fear makes extraordinary measures feel ordinary. And perhaps most dangerously, fear can make neighbors suspicious of one another because authoritarian systems rarely survive through government power alone. They survive when fear spreads socially. People begin policing one another, language, belief, association, behavior, and suddenly the system exists everywhere, not simply inside government building, inside relationships, inside communities, inside people's mind. That is where authoritarianism becomes culturally powerful. When citizens begin enforcing the system against one another, and science fiction understand why fear works so well. Fear simplifies complicated worlds. It gives people an enemy, an explanation, a protector, a mission. Complex social problems become emotionally easier when everything can be blamed on a dangerous them. And that is why authoritarian systems often need enemies. External enemies, internal enemies, cultural enemies, and political enemies. Somebody must remain dangerous because fear justifies control. Without fear, people might begin asking, why do we need all of this power? Why do we need all of this surveillance? Why can't we question leadership? Why can't the system tolerate disagreement? And once those questions begin, the emotional foundation of authoritarianism starts weakening. But not every system maintains control primarily through fear. Sometimes control becomes entertainment. That is what we that's what makes the hunter game so fascinating. Panium is brutally unequal. The capital possesses enormous wealth. The district experiences radically different conditions. Resources flow upward. Power remains concentrated. And every year, the Hunger Games remind everyone who controls the system. But notice how the games are presented. They are not merely punishment, they are spectacle, fashion, celebrity, drama, narrative, entertainment. The violence become packaged, stigmatized, consumed, and science fiction is making an important point. Power does not always want people terrified. Sometimes it wants them distracted because distraction can accomplish something repression cannot. It can make people emotionally disengaged from injustice. If suffering becomes entertainment, people may stop recognizing it as suffering. If politics becomes spectacle, people may stop thinking about consequences. If everything becomes performance, reality itself becomes harder to see. The capital understands this. It transforms oppression into ceremony, and ceremony normalizes power. People know exactly what is happening, but repetition makes the unacceptable feel familiar. That connects directly to what we discussed in episode 28. Civilization often decay through normalization, not because people wake up one morning and choose injustice. It's because they become accustomed to it. The extraordinary become routine. The shocking becomes entertainment. The morally disturbing becomes background noise. And eventually people stop reacting. That emotional numbness is increasingly useful to system of power because oppression does not require universal support. Sometimes it only requires widespread disengagement. You got people saying, that doesn't affect me. That's just how things are. Nothing will change. Why get involved? And suddenly, apathy becomes politically valuable. Science fiction repeatedly warns us a civilization can lose freedom not only because people are frightened, sometimes because they are entertained enough not to even notice. One reason I find Star Trek Mirror Universe so interesting is that it asks us to imagine something deeper than a bad government. Imagine a culture where domination itself has become normal. Advancement comes through betrayal. Authority comes through strength. Trust become weakness. Compassion become vulnerability. Violence become a legitimate path towards status. And this matters because civilization eventually teaches people what behaviors are rewarded. Every society creates incentive. Who gets rewarded? Cooperation, in- integrity, service, truth, compassion, or aggression, loyalty to power, manipulation, fear, self preservation. Over time, those incentives shape culture, and culture shapes people. That what makes the mirror universe in Star Trek more than a fun reversal of Star Trek. What kind of human beings do systems produce? Because institutions are never neutral. A society built around distrust produces people skilled at distrust. A society built around fear produces people skilled at survival. A society built around domination produces people who understand relationship primarily through power. And eventually the system began reproducing itself. People behave harshly because harshness is rewarded. Others learn from them. Children inherit expectation. Institution reinforce behavior. And what began as political structure becomes culturally instinct. And that is much harder to change because overthrowing a ruler is one thing, changing what people believe power is supposed to look like is another. Science fiction understands this. Revolution can remove governments, but civilization must also confront the habits those governments created, such as fear, distrust, cruelty, suspicion, obedience. Otherwise, a new ruler may simply inherit the machinery of the old system and basically use it again. So, after all these stories, we arrive at the uncomfortable question: why do people accept systems that reduce their freedom? Science fiction rarely gives us one answer. Sometimes it's fear, sometimes exhaustion, sometimes propaganda, inequality, or genuine crisis. Sometimes people simply want normal life to continue. And that last one may be more important than we realize. Most people are not trying to become political heroes. They're trying to raise families, go to work, protect people they love, find stability, build a future. An authoritarian system can exploit that desire. They say, don't worry about the larger question. We'll handle them. Just cooperate. Just don't cause trouble. Just trust the system. And for a while, that can feel reasonable because resistance is expensive. Speaking up can cost something: social standing, employment, security, relationships, sometimes life itself. Science fiction understands that moral courage is difficult precisely because ordinary life matters. Heroes in these type of stories are rarely people who do not care about consequences. They care deeply. That's why the choice is hard. And this brings us back to one of the recurring ideas of the sci-fi griot. Moral responsibility cannot be completely outsourced, not to technology, not to institution, not to leaders, not to system. Civilization requires ordinary people willing to ask, is this right? Not merely is this legal? Not merely is this efficient? Not merely does this keep me safe, but is this right? That question is dangerous to system obsessed with control because conscience creates limits. Conscience says, there are things I will not do. There are people I will not dehumanize. There are lies I will not repeat. There are freedoms I will not surrender casually. There are injustices I will not pretend not to see. And authoritarianism struggles against conscience because conscience creates a loyalty higher than obedience. That is why these science fiction stories repeatedly celebrate seemingly small acts: remembering something forbidden, helping others, telling the truth, refusing an order, protecting a stranger, keeping a book, preserving a story, asking a question. These actions look small, but inside a system built around total obedience, small acts of conscience become revolutionary. And perhaps this is the distinction science fiction wants us to understand most clearly. Order is not the same thing as peace. A society can be orderly, but deeply unjust. People can be quiet because they are afraid. Streets can be calm because dissent has been eliminated. Institution can function while human dignity disappears. That's not necessarily peace, but sometimes that is simply controlled silence. Real peace requires something more difficult, such as trust, justice, participation, accountability, human dignity, the ability to disagree without becoming enemy, the ability to criticize institutions without being treated as threats, the ability to reform system before collapse become necessary. Those things are messy. They require patience, debate, compromise, moral courage, and uncertainty. But science fiction repeatedly suggests that healthy civilization must learn to tolerate some uncertainty because human beings themselves are uncertain. We change, we disagree, we surprise one another, we make mistakes, we learn, we grow. System cannot tolerate those realities eventually because trying to eliminate them, and that is when order becomes oppressive. The healthiest civilization is not merely the civilization with the most control, but perhaps it is the civilization capable of remaining stable without needing total control. That requires trust, and trust is much harder to build than surveillance. Trust requires leaders to accept accountability, institutions to accept criticism, citizens to accept responsibility, communities to tolerate disagreement, and everyone to recognize something fundamental. The people who disagree with us are still people. Once that recognition disappears, control becomes easier because dehumanization makes almost anything politically possible. And science fiction knows this. That is why authoritarian futures so often begin by dividing people into categories: loyal and disloyal, citizen and outsider, human, replicant, mutant, alien, a belter, rebel, enemy. Once something become a category, it becomes easier to stop seeing the person. And once people stop seeing one another, power becomes much harder to restrain. So what happens when order becomes more important than freedom? Science fiction gives us a consistent warning. Society begins trading uncertainty for control, privacy, for surveillance, dissent, for conformity, responsibility, for obedience, and eventually freedom becomes something the civilization remembers rather than practices. But perhaps the most disturbing part is people may not recognize the trade while it is happening because every individual sacrifice can appear reasonable, temporarily necessary, small. One emergency measure, one additional surveillance system, one restricted freedom, one silent voice, one group treated as dangerous, one uncomfortable truth ignored, and slowly the extraordinary become normal. That is why science fiction keeps returning to authoritarian futures. Not because the genre believes tyranny is inevitable, but because these stories function as warnings. They ask us to recognize patterns early, before fear becomes identity, before control becomes culture, before obedience becomes virtue, before power becomes unquestionable, before people forget that institution exists to serve human beings, not the other way around. And perhaps that is why the heroes of these type of science fiction stories are rarely perfect. They are frightened, confused, sometimes compromised, sometimes late to understand what is happening. But eventually they make a choice. They stop asking only, how do I survive inside this system? And begin asking, what kind of system am I helping to sustain? That question changes everything because civilization are not abstraction. They are built through millions of human decision. What people tolerate, what people reward, what people ignore, what people remember, what people resist, what people teach the next generation, and what people are willing to defend. Episode 28 asks why empire collapsed. Today we discovered one possible response to that fear of collapse. Control everything, eliminate uncertainty, demand obedience, make order sacred. But science fiction keep telling us that solution creates another problem. Because when civilization become obsessed with maintaining control, eventually someone refuses, someone rebels, someone says no. And that brings us to our next question. Because rebellion is one of science fiction oldest stories. The Rebel Alliance, the Freemans, the Resistant, the Maquis, the people of District 13, underground movements, freedom fighters, revolutionaries. And science fiction can also ask a harder question than why do people rebel? It asks, when is rebellion justified? And when does resistance become a moral responsibility? And perhaps even more importantly, what happens when the rebels finally win? Because overthrowing a system and building something better are two very different things. And that's where we're headed next. Episode 30, when is rebellion justified? This has been the Sci-Fi Griot, a place to slow down, to reflect, and to remember that the strongest civilization may not be the one capable of controlling everyone, but the one strong enough to allow people to remain free. And one final reflection thought. If giving up one freedom could make society significantly safer, would you do it? What about two freedoms? 5, 10. And at what point would safety stop feeling like protection and start feeling like control?